They may only have 2 Super Bowl wins between them, but that's never stopped the AFC South from having plenty of fantasy football superstars. Today, we take a deep dive into the Deep South, from coaching changes to a king deposed. Join us as we talk all things AFC South during our fortnight of fantasy deep dives on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our rankings are on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and you can also see my articles and other content over on Razzball as well. Today we're talking about the AFC South, and this is the division that has struggled for a long time. In fact, they've got a 3-12 record in divisional playoffs in the last 15 years. They've only won 2 Super Bowls between them, and they've generally struggled when it comes to playoff time. Can they turn things around this year? Well, we don't care about that today because we're talking about fantasy football, and there are a lot of fantasy superstars in this division. It's traditionally been a very running back heavy division, but we saw things turn around with CJ Stroud, so it seems fitting to start things off with the Houston Texans.
The Houston Texans select C.J. Stroud, quarterback, Ohio State.
Stroud floating one deep. Tank Dell. He makes the catch.
And Tank Dell's down.
Now, in the last 15 years, the Texans have actually been the most successful team in this division. If you've only been following the NFL for a while, you might think of them as being perennial losers. But before that, they've made the playoffs in 7 of the last 15 or so years as the division winners. And it's a good chance they'll continue that trend this year. They've really turned things around. They've turned themselves into a very strong offensive team. D'Amico Ryan's done a pretty good job, especially as a traditionally defensive-minded coach, of having a very good offensive game. They've obviously led things with CJ Stroud, but him being on his rookie contract has allowed them to spend up elsewhere. They've been in the top half of both points for and points again, which is always a good sign. They tend to be a little bit on the pass-heavy side, and they've definitely got an aging roster, but they've brought in a lot of good experience to support their young quarterback, and I expect that to continue this year. You can see they don't have a lot of guys on your long contracts, and most of the guys who are their rookies who they've only brought in recently, which is a good way of building the roster. They have brought in some veteran talent this season with Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs coming in particular, and they haven't really lost many big players. In fact, when I do these graphics, I generally try to put any 5 players that I can find, just the 5 most fantasy relevant additions and losses, even though I have to dig really deep. I couldn't find 5. I had to go literally to their backup kicker to even find a 4th. They've done a really good job of keeping around the talent that they had last season. I expect them to make more steps forward this season. And that can only mean good things for their quarterback, CJ Stroud. Now, to be fair, he was only the QB 13 last year, but it's very hard to be a quarterback in your rookie season in the NFL. Most quarterbacks take a couple of years to kind of get into things, and given he had a roster that had been really unsuccessful for the previous 3 years, it was surprising that he was so good. They're now bringing in Stephon Diggs as an extra pass catcher for him, and they bring back all of the other talent they already had. Plus, they brought in even more talent in guys like Joe Mixon, who can help distract from the passing game and give him an actual ground game, which they didn't really have last year. Singletary's not very big back, and they also had Dameon Pierce, who really struggled to get anything going. So hopefully Mixon will really help Stroud. He comes in as my QB7 in Dynasty, and a lot of people have him even higher. I think that's a little bit aggressive because we just haven't seen it yet. We know he's a talented quarterback, and we know there's good players around him, but he doesn't tend to scramble a great deal, and that can really hurt for fantasy. He's good at getting the ball downfield, and he gets a lot of yardage, and he doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. All of those things are positive for fantasy, and certainly if you're in a league where you get 6-point passing touchdowns, and which therefore doesn't benefit rushing as much, certainly Stroud's someone that you can take a little bit earlier than this. Me personally, I still prefer guys like Caleb Williams over him. I feel like he has a little bit more upside, but Stroud's certainly close to him. I think there's a real conversation to be had around Stroud, Williams, also Lamar Jackson and Anthony Richardson. It really depends on your league structure and what sort of player you want. You've got to feel like CJ Stroud's going to be around in this league for a lot longer than some of those running-based quarterbacks, and that makes him a little bit safer, even if the upside isn't quite there. Now, he doesn't really have any clear backups. Case Keenum wasn't particularly good last year, and he's 36. Davis Mills has clearly lost his starting job. Now he's a QB3. So if Stroud goes down, that's not going to mean great things about this offense, but I still think it will be able to tick over. It's just going to hurt their wide receivers a little bit. Now, the biggest concern with Stroud, his passing actually wasn't quite as good as it might have seemed to those people looking at it. He didn't make a lot of mistakes, but he also wasn't really making particularly accurate passes. Look at that PFF passer rating. That's not as high as a lot of the top guys you expect. So while he was good, and while he got away with not making too many interceptions, the reality was he was just solid. And that's okay for a rookie quarterback, but we do need to see him step up a little bit this year. Now, the run game is hopefully going to be a lot better this year, and I do expect Joe Mixon to be the main guy. He wasn't fantastic last year. 4 yards per carry is average, but then again, the Cincinnati O-line isn't exactly perfect either. I think that he'll probably take a step up with this O-line, but then again, Dameon Pierce really struggled with him after looking pretty good in his rookie season. There has been a lot of buzz about Pierce being more involved this year. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. He didn't look particularly good last year, and frankly, he only got by on volume in his first year, so I can't imagine that they're going to use him a lot. I think we probably don't see a lot of anyone, but just a heap of Joe Mixon and then a mix of the other guys to kind of give him a rest. I know that they bring in Jawar Jordan, who's obviously a rookie, and he looked fine in college, but I don't think he's much more than a special teams guy personally. He could be out there on a reasonable amount of snaps. He might take over that backup role. He might take over that receiving role, which is why I've got him as 0 to 40% snaps. But realistically, I think he's probably going to be mostly a special teams guy. I think this is Joe Mixon's backfield, which is why I've got him ranked pretty high, even as a dynasty ranking, because I think he's going to be particularly good this year. I think he could arguably be a top 12 running back, because they do need to take a little bit of that load off CJ Stroud. Now, they have also helped Stroud out by bringing in Stephon Diggs, and a lot of people are liking Stephon Diggs in this situation. I don't see that at all. I think he goes into a situation where Nico Collins is the clear number one. Tank Dell is offering a lot. He looked really good in his rookie season despite being injured a fair bit. I think Diggs is mostly in here because they don't want to have to use a lot of Robert Woods and a lot of Noah Brown when these guys are getting injured. They just didn't have enough of a healthy Nico Collins and enough of a healthy Tank Dell. In fact, they had 4 good wide receivers last season, and they didn't have all 4 of them healthy at any point during the season. As soon as one would come back, another one would go down. So we never really got a feel for exactly what they were doing there. That's going to be even messier now that Stephon Diggs comes in. We know that Diggs can be a bit of a prickly character when he's in a dressing room where he doesn't feel like he's getting the touches he thinks he deserves. And it's going to be hard for him to get touches off Collins and Dell, who clearly have good chemistry with Stroud and looked pretty darn good last year. Admittedly, Collins did have a big breakout, and we didn't really expect it to come. Tank Dell was someone we thought was probably going to be good out of college. So it's hard to know exactly how they're going to use these guys. Clearly, Diggs is going to be on the outside somewhere, and they're going to cycle Dell and a little bit of Collins through the slot. But I expect a lot of 3 wide receiver sets. The problem is, if Diggs isn't getting the ball passed to him, is he going to blow this up, and is this going to become a real issue for the team? Regardless, you no longer need to take an interest in Robert Woods and Noah Brown in fantasy. Even honestly, if one of these guys gets injured, as we saw last year, it wasn't really clear exactly who would step in. And I don't think we really know whether it would be Woods or Brown. Woods is actually being paid a pretty big contract at the moment, and Brown is only a 6th or 7th rounder. So I think realistically, you just ignore those guys in fantasy, even off your bench, and just focus on these main 3. I think these guys are all going to get plenty of targets, and they're going to be functional in fantasy, though Diggs is the kind of guy you should be selling off in Dynasty. Now, Dalton Schultz just got given a big contract, and realistically, he earned it. He's been pretty good the last few years. Doesn't look like a top 5 tight end anymore, and I don't think that's going to happen now that he's in Houston, but I do still think he's a reasonable fantasy option. I don't think he has that same clear path to longevity and clear path to targets as a lot of the other guys do, but he's managed to stay healthy a lot, and that's given him good fantasy finishes. I think he's still a solid option, but ideally I don't want him as my number 1 starter. I'd much have someone who's got a little bit more upside rather than a guy who's going to be fighting 3 good wide receivers and a strong running back in an offense that's good, but they're not the top 4 scoring offense in the league, and I don't think they will be in this coming year. Schultz is backed up by Cade Stover, who comes in as a rookie. I think that he'll need time to develop, and it's going to be a bit of a rotation with him, Brevin Jordan, and Tegan Quitoriano. I think Quitoriano is actually going to be the guy that's on the field a little bit more, potentially initially as more of a blocking back, and I think Stover slowly starts to take that role over a little bit. I think they're kind of probably done a little bit with Brevin Jordan, but because he's a receiving back, he does have a little bit more upside. I don't think Quitoriano is going to take that role over if Schultz gets injured. I think Jordan gets the first chance at it, and over time, Stover's slowly going to turn into that number 2 tight end, and I presume that they might even be considering transitioning him to the league role in 2 or 3 years down the track. What that means for Schultz, I don't know, but certainly this is going to be Schultz's job at least for the next 2 or 3 years. So that's the Texans. Next, let's head over to the Indianapolis Colts.
The Indianapolis Colts select Anthony Richardson.
Richardson going to take off on a quarterback draw. He's at the 10. He's at the 5. Untouched into the end zone. Touchdown. RPO backs to throw. Going to take a shot downfield from Michael Pittman Jr. And he's got the ball. And his helmet came out. And Anthony Richardson is down on the field.
Anthony Richardson officially out for the remainder of his rookie season.
Now, the Colts are, of course, the only team in this division to actually win a Super Bowl. They won back in 2009, and the previous one was back in 1971. So it's been a bit of a drought for them, but not compared to the rest of the teams in this division. Now, they have had a couple of average years, but they still managed to look okay last year in Shane Steichen's first year after a real dud of a year in 2022. They scored a lot of points, but their defense really struggled. Plus, they did all that without their new rookie quarterback, Anthony Richardson, who was injured for most of the season. Now, Gardner Minshew stepped in and he looked pretty good, but they've gone in a different direction. They've brought in Joe Flacco, who we've seen is also very capable of stepping in and doing a good job. I think Minshew probably felt like he deserved an opportunity at a starting job. Joe Flacco is clearly happy to be the backup and step in when it necessitates. And I think Richardson's the kind of guy who really could get injured based on his play style. So bringing in Flacco was a real wise decision. Because Richardson on a rookie contract, as Stroud is, we can see they're spending their money elsewhere, and they've done it really wisely by bulking up their O-line. We know Quentin Nelson's one of the best in the game. Plus, after giving Pittman the franchise tag, they then signed him to a longer contract, which I think was a good idea. I think Pittman's actually been very good the last few years. They have been very run-heavy. In fact, even last year when they didn't have Jonathan Taylor around, they were still one of the most run-heavy teams in the league. Zach Moss was quite successful for them. That big O-line really does help them there. In fact, they had the lowest passing touchdown percentage in the league. Be interesting to see how that changes with Anthony Richardson. I think probably it doesn't a lot. They've got all the same play callers coming back. It's all the same style of play, and Richardson's a guy who can run it in himself as well. So I think everything suggests that this is going to be a pretty run-heavy offense, and the passing game is mainly going to be filtered through Michael Pittman with a little bit of the other guys brought in there. Now, it could be interesting to see what that means for Richardson in fantasy. Realistically, you do want to see him running quite a lot. He didn't scramble as much as you'd expect, but they did have plenty of designed runs for him, and I think he's probably going to continue running despite that injury, if you believe what he's been saying. It will be interesting to see whether he can up his accuracy a little bit. I know he looks good in those early games, but it wasn't because he was accurate. It's because he scrambled really well, and the offense just managed to make it work. They had such a strong run game, and his scrambling was so dangerous that we didn't really get to see just how bad his passing was. And as you can see from his PFF grades, it was pretty bad. Realistically, he needs to be a lot more accurate than that. He needs to be able to pass the ball deep, which he can do okay, but he also needs to be better in those medium to short areas where he really struggled with his accuracy. We saw that was an issue in college, didn't play a lot of games in college, and he didn't have this off season and the rest of last season to fully improve on that because he was injured the whole time. So I feel like that's really going to be a step back in his progression. And that's why I'm not really willing to be too aggressive in going out and getting him in Dynasty. I know a lot of people will happily take him ahead of guys like CJ Stroud, Lamar Jackson even, Caleb Williams he's going ahead of in most leagues. I don't see it there. For me, he and Jaden Daniels are very close. The fact that we've actually seen Richardson look okay in actual plays, the reason I've got him ahead of Daniels. But realistically, I think Daniels probably even has more of a ceiling, and I'd happily take him over Richardson in certain situations. So we need to see a lot more from Anthony Richardson as a passer before I'm willing to feel good about him as a quarterback in this league long term, and that affects his value in Dynasty in particular. Having said that, in redraft, he's going to be very valuable this year. We know how good he is on the ground. That's going to give a lot of fantasy points. Now, the running backs have always been good in Indianapolis. It's been the case ever since Jonathan Taylor arrived. And even when Zach Moss had to step in, he also looked very good as well. Heck, when Taylor went down late in the year, even Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson looked good. This is just a really good run game backed up by an excellent O-line. And that means Taylor is still a really good fantasy asset if he can stay healthy. It was only a couple of years ago that he was the clear running back one and being taken first in drafts, but a couple of injury-ravaged seasons have really dropped that off. Can he get back? Well, those injuries aren't necessarily things that are going to stop him long-term. He should technically be able to continue playing without too many issues. Has it sapped any of his explosiveness? Well, he still looks good last year. I think he still potentially could be that same running back. The running back position is one that is very injury risk high. Basically, your running backs are going to get injured no matter who they are. Some of them can avoid it by their style of play, and Taylor doesn't necessarily do that. He is quite a physical runner, but if they can get him into open space a little bit more by checking down a bit more, I think that would help him out. The problem is that's not really Richardson's game, and that's not the style of play they've used previously. I think realistically, Taylor is someone they can probably just continue to use and run into the ground, knowing that they can bring in other running backs and still have them be functional in this offense. Now, who's the backup? Well, I don't know. A lot of people have been saying Evan Hull. I don't really see that. He didn't look particularly special last year on the limited touches he got. I know he was injured for most of last season, but even in the preseason, it didn't say anything that said, yeah, this guy's going to be good. And nothing he did at college made me feel particularly good about it. Trey Sermon is someone who was a third-round pick a couple of years ago, and he actually looked good when given the opportunity last year. I kind of think it's probably going to be Sermon as the main guy, and we see either Goodson or Hull as the receiving back. And I think it might even be Goodson as the receiving back. I'm not that convinced on Evan Hull. None of these guys have a lot of upside because I think it's some sort of committee situation if Taylor gets injured, but I'm willing to give Sermon the higher rating in my dynasty rankings because I do think he's probably going to be the number 2 back that spells Taylor during the season. Now, that'll change real quickly if we hear news suggesting that something different is going to happen or if we see them used differently in the preseason. So that'll definitely be an area to look out for. But realistically, Taylor's the number 1 guy here. I know he's ranked pretty high for a guy that's been playing for 4 seasons and has had a lot of injuries. But for me, running backs are really only ever going to help you for a few seasons. And Taylor's in one of the best positions in fantasy football. Now, the wide receiver room's interesting because Michael Pittman has looked very good, but he hasn't had to receive passes much from Anthony Richardson, and we know that Richardson is not the greatest passer. Minshew was actually really good for Pittman, and Richardson's injury really helped Pittman. The question is, can he do it with a quarterback who's not particularly accurate and is more of a running quarterback than a passing quarterback? I don't know. Realistically, I have no idea, but I do think there is a chance that this works out really well. I think Pittman's the clear number 1 in this offense. I know they brought in Adonai Mitchell, but he was more of a risky pick in the mid to late second round where they easily could have taken one a lot earlier. So they chose to go with Mitchell instead. Now, Mitchell's a very talented player, but there were reasons he fell. It wasn't really play related. According to Charlie Campbell, who does Why the Slide for Walter Football, and I've spoken to those guys quite a bit, it does seem that they simply thought that Mitchell is too much of a character risk for most teams, but the Colts were willing to take a chance with him because the price was right. That mid to late second round is that area where you're willing to take a shot on riskier players. That's why Mitchell fell that low, but the talent is certainly there. Is he going to battle Pittman for that number 1 role? I don't think so, but it's certainly possible. He is more of an outside receiver. Josh Downs is the main slot guy, but I do expect that we see Pittman coming out of the slot a lot. I expect them to use quite a few 2 tight end sets as well. So I think they'll probably mix things around to try to keep that running game going. But for me, Pittman's the clear number 1. Mitchell's a guy that's interesting in rookie drafts. He's around that 8, 9, 10 region, depending on who you are. I've got him behind Leggett, and I really get battle with him and Jalen Polk because Polk has a clearer role to go into, but he goes into a weaker offense. Both of those offenses are very run-heavy, as we've seen, and that makes Mitchell a little bit risky, but at least he does have a lot of upside. Now, obviously, Alec Pierce was that every down guy last time. We didn't really see him particularly heavily involved. I think that was just Pierce not getting into position to get the ball. I don't think that was anything about that role that he was playing. I don't think because Mitchell's playing the Pierce role, all of a sudden he's not going to get the ball. I think that he's going to be able to earn touches and be the clear number 2. And if anything, that really hurts Josh Downs, who looked pretty good at times last year as their number 2 receiver. I think suddenly he becomes the number 3 and he's more of an afterthought in this offense. I know Anthony Gould was another rookie who came in. He's a special teams guy. You don't need to worry about him. Everyone else from Pierce downwards on the depth chart isn't of interest in fantasy football. Now, the tight end room is exactly the same in that they're not of interest for fantasy football. We have no idea who's going to be the main guy here. I know we were holding out hope it would be Jelani Woods, but missing a full season is not the greatest thing for your prospects in an NFL team. Coaches don't love that, and I don't like his chances of taking over a clear lead role here. I think they're going to continue that committee situation. Will Mallory looked okay in his rookie season. Mo Alley-Cox will do a lot of the blocking work, but he also gets some ball in the red zone, which can only hurt the other guys. Jelani Woods looks solid in his first season, but I don't think he looks so special that he's going to take over that lead role. And Colin Granson's still there as the nominal lead guy last season. I think we're just going to see a big mix of these guys. They'll throw them in a pot, stir them around, and pick out whoever comes on for a certain situation. Plus, Andrew Ogilvy actually looked pretty good before he was out suspended for this season. So could even get uglier in the future. I don't want any part of these guys.
Where does Lawrence go here? Feeling the pressure, throws on third down. Wide open, it's Kirk.
Etienne bounces out of trouble. Etienne to the end zone. Touchdown.
Treadwell's down there. Treadwell holds on.
Lawrence sets and throws a deep shot. It's caught by Etienne. Etienne is going to take it all the way.
Doug Peterson looked pretty good in his first year as the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach, but we expected them to take a bit of a step forward in their second year. That didn't really happen. We thought that Trevor Lawrence would take steps forward, and he looked pretty average. The run game became a real focus, which isn't exactly what we expected from them. Travis Etienne was scoring a lot of touchdowns, and that was really making a difference for Lawrence in fantasy. I don't really know what to expect from them this year. Are we going to see something similar where we see a lot of Etienne around the red zone, but they pass the ball a lot otherwise? They've certainly been aggressive in going out and getting wide receivers. They drafted Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round. They brought in Gabe Davis after losing Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones. I don't love the fact that they got rid of Zay Jones. I think he's actually a very solid player and would have been a good number 3 for them. I don't really understand why they needed to spend money on bringing in Gabe Davis and giving him a really long contract when he hasn't actually proven himself in the league. That didn't make sense to me, but I do understand them removing Ridley from the situation. He actually goes to their divisional rivals. Ridley is known as being a little bit of a difficult guy in the change rooms, and I can understand them wanting someone who's going to be a little bit more positive in that situation. They also bring in a better backup in Mac Jones, and I think that they might sneakily hope that he competes a little bit with Trevor Lawrence and just pushes him along a little bit. They also improved the kicking game, bringing in Riley Patterson. I don't know. These have been okay changes, but you'd hope for a little bit more when you've got a rookie who's still got a couple of years left on his rookie contract. Lawrence is ultimately their 4th highest paid guy while on his rookie contract. And that's a little bit strange when you're a team that should be challenging at least for the title. Instead, they've got the 6th most cap space and they haven't used it very efficiently. They've given the most money to Christian Kirk, who's not a number 1 wide receiver. Even though he looked good last year, realistically, you want him to be a number 2 and you want to bring in a real superstar receiver to take on that number 1 job. Plus, you don't want your inside linebacker to be your 3rd highest paid player. I just don't think any of this makes sense. I don't really understand what they're doing. The coaching has been good, but the management of the team hasn't been quite right. I don't think they're ready to challenge yet. And I'm not sure exactly how this is going to look for Trevor Lawrence, who realistically has struggled a little bit for fantasy, given how much passing volume he's had. He went over 4,000 yards, but he's throwing so many interceptions and leaving a lot of yards on the field. He should be doing so much better. And the upside's there and the talent's there. We're just not seeing it happen. His passing accuracy is off. He's not running particularly well. He's scrambling a lot, but not getting a lot of yardage from it. I don't know. It's just all not working. He needs to be significantly more accurate, especially in those mid-range passes. And that's really hurting his wide receivers who haven't been able to be effective, even though he passes into those areas more than the average player does. something needs to change here. Lawrence needs to step up, or they need to make some sort of move, because at the moment it's not working. Mac Jones comes in to challenge him. I don't want him being taking over and taking that starting role unless he's going to prove that he's actually significantly better and the issue was actually New England. So Lawrence is still the main guy for me. I rank him pretty high in fantasy because I think there's upside there. He's got a good rushing floor when he uses it properly. We just haven't seen him be accurate. And I do have some fears over losing his job long term. I do think they're going to give him another couple of years at least to get it right, though. Now, we saw the run game look pretty effective last year with Travis Etienne being the second highest scoring fantasy running back last year. And that was a little bit surprising, because they talked a lot in the preseason about how it was going to be a committee and they didn't want Etienne being used too much. And even in this preseason, they've said exactly the same thing. Oh, we don't want to put too much yards on him. We don't want to give him too many carries. Well, they gave him well over 300 touches. He went over 1,000 yards on the ground alone and ended up with 12 touchdowns. Now, that's good for fantasy, but he wasn't actually particularly good. He's averaging under 4 yards a carry. He wasn't as explosive as we know he could be. They need to mix it up a little bit. They tried to use Dearness Johnson, who was, I don't know, he was okay when he was with the Browns, but realistically, he's very much a number 3 running back style. You'd think drafting Tank Bigsby pretty early on in the draft back in 23 would mean that you're going to use him. Instead, he gets, 50 rushes and literally 1 reception. And we thought they were going to use him around the goal line, which was going to really hurt Etienne. That didn't happen in the end. So I'm not really sure what to make of this whole situation. I think going into next year, it probably looks pretty similar. After all, the coaching staff are coming back. It kind of worked last year in a weird sort of way. So I think we probably still see Etienne being the guy for the most part, with a little bit of Johnson mixed in. I think they might use a little bit more of Bigsby as the year goes on, especially so they don't run down Etienne too much. The question is, what happens if the number 1 goes down? Is it Johnson? Is it Bigsby? Well, it's probably just an ugly committee. Realistically, I don't really want any part of these backups. I was interested in Johnson's at times last year because he was getting used a little bit, but I think they're probably going to try to get Bigsby a little bit more involved, and that makes me very wary of using any of these other guys. For me, it's kind of Etienne or bust. Now, the wide receiver room is a little bit more interesting, and there's a lot of talent there. It'll be interesting to see how they use it. Now, Brian Thomas Jr. comes in, and for me, he's probably the actual number 1 here. I think he's got the most upside, especially in Dynasty. Christian Kirk is going to be the number 1 on the field, but Thomas is the number 1 for Dynasty. And maybe in our hearts, I don't know, maybe we'll grow to really love him as well. Thomas is a high upside player. Arguably, for a lot of people, the fourth best rookie this year. I actually like Keon Coleman going into his situation a little bit better. I talked about that in the AFC East deep dive. If you haven't heard that one already. Thomas, for me, is very close to Xavier Worthy as being the number 5. The problem with Thomas is that he's got a lot of upside, but he's also got a lot of downside. There are minor character issues, major catching issues and drops issues. He's very explosive, but he runs lazy routes or doesn't get things quite right. I don't know. He needs a lot of development. I don't know if the Jags are the right team to quite do that. I don't know that we've seen them successfully do that a lot. Kirk's looked good, but he was already a developed prospect by the time he came through. So I don't know exactly how they're planning on making this work, but Thomas is going to be the clear outside guy. He's going to be used a lot. Gabe Davis will go deep like he always does. That's not particularly valuable for fantasy, especially when Trevor Lawrence doesn't really pass the ball deep that often. So I think it's probably going to be Kirk as the main guy. Even though he's not out there on every snap, he's very efficient when he's involved because he's their slot guy. They use him quite a lot and he gets a lot of targets. The question is, can Christian Kirk stay healthy? Because when he has, he's been very good for fantasy. The problem is he's had major injuries in 3 of the last 5 seasons. If he can stay healthy, I do like his chances of being the clear number 1 guy, and he could be quite valuable in redraft. The problem is in Dynasty, those injuries are going to build up, and he's probably only got a couple of years left in him. So I don't know. For Dynasty, Kirk's someone you really only want if you're trying to win now. Thomas is someone you probably don't want if you want to win now. I think it might take him a year or 2 to really click into gear. You probably want to wait a little bit with him and go for someone who's a little bit more win now focused, and maybe take a veteran like a Devontae Adams and Amari Cooper, because I think you can probably get them for a similar value for Thomas. As for Gabe Davis, I have no interest in him. Because he tends to stay healthy, he's probably going to be a top 50 wide receiver, but you're going to get some boom games, you're going to get some bust games, unless you're playing best ball, not particularly valuable for him. Now, interestingly, there's not really anyone in behind them. It used to be kind of Jamal Agnew a little bit, even though he's their special teams guy. They used a little bit of Parker Washington last season. Tim Jones got involved a little bit. They even used some Elijah Cooks. I think it's just going to be a big mess. I don't even know who's going to be the backup. I think it'll probably be Washington, but he's not someone I particularly want for fantasy. Now, their true number one receiver last year was oddly kind of Evan Ingram. If you look at his stats compared to Christian Kirk's stats, you can see that even though Kirk was injured for 5 games, even if you blow those up, you're still getting more targets for Ingram on a per game basis. He was very heavily involved, and we know that Lawrence loves to go into those shorter areas, and they used Ingram effectively. The last 2 years, couple of top 5 finishes. The problem is Ingram is aging a little bit. They are trying to use the wide receivers a little bit more. So while I think Ingram could be good for another year or two, I think there's probably more upside to other tight ends around him. I think it was more of a volume-based success that he had last season. Now, interestingly, he finished 4th overall among all tight ends with only 4 touchdowns, which is a very low total for fantasy successful tight ends. Usually, tight ends make most of their money through touchdowns, so that's a little bit surprising, but I think in PPR, he still has quite a bit of value for now. I just don't know how long that's going to last. The other interesting thing is they don't really have anyone clear coming up behind him. They did use plenty of Luke Farrell. They brought in Brenton Strange as quite an early round pick. It was a day 2 pick, and they didn't really use him. We know that rookie tight ends do usually take a long time to develop. We didn't see it last year with Sam Laporta, but most rookie tight ends do look pretty average, and they take a little bit of time to get going. That could happen with Strange. For that reason, I do like him a little bit more in fantasy than Luke Farrell, where we kind of know what we're getting now. Having said that, I do think Farrell's probably going to be the better guy this year. I think if Ingram goes down, you don't want either of these guys. It's Ingram or bust in the tight ends for Jacksonville as well.
Levis off the fake, looking for Hopkins. He's got it. Touchdown, Tennessee.
Here's Henry, Wildcat. They get it back to Levis. Levis going to put some air under it. Towards the end zone, it's caught. Hopkins.
On first down, they pitch it. Spears has blockers. Spears inside Chargers territory.
They fake it to Henry. Levis on the move. Wide open. Okonkwo at the 30. Still going. Okonkwo finally pushed out of bounds.
Now, the Tennessee Titans have actually been sneakily pretty darn good over the last few years. They should have hit the rebuild button probably a year or two earlier, and they didn't. I think that ultimately cost Mike Vrabel his job. He was trying to kind of hold on and keep having success with that method that had been working for so long, and he just wasn't able to replicate it. I think they really needed to have some faith in him, let him rebuild properly, and then they ultimately would have gone and had some success. Now they have a sophomore quarterback who hasn't had a full season of experience when they probably should have gotten him in there a little bit earlier. They're paying quite a lot of money to some older guys, and I'm not really sure that makes a whole lot of sense. I don't think D-Hop and Calvin Ridley would be the guys I'd be giving my money to if I was still kind of a little bit into a rebuild. You've got a whole heap of first-year guys. You've got a first-year head coach who's also going to call plays. You've got a first-year OC who's really only ever been a run game coordinator or worse. And you've got a first-year defensive coordinator who's only ever been a positional backs coach. So I don't really know how this is going to work. I think it's probably going to be ugly for another year, and I don't understand why they've spent so much on veterans. They really should be trying to rebuild here. If you look at the guys they've brought in, guys like Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd, good players, but aging players. And Ridley's not exactly known for being the greatest of room presences. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work. They bring in Tony Pollard as well, who looked pretty average for the Cowboys. I wouldn't say he looked washed, but they certainly couldn't make it work. I'm not really sure what they're trying to do there. I understand that King Henry leaves and you need to replace him with someone. Tony Pollard is not who I would have gone for. I also probably wouldn't have drafted someone, so it did make sense to bring in someone, but you've got Tyjae Spears here. Just get a cheap alternative guy who can be the big back and yet let Spears do what he does. Instead, you've got Pollard and you're trying to create another lightning situation, unlike the actual way that it should be done with Zeke and Pollard back with the Cowboys. I don't really understand what they're trying to do here. Just the way they've built their roster doesn't make sense. It's mostly young, but they're spending all their money on veterans, but they're not guys who are going to help develop those younger guys. They're kind of all in the same positions. I don't quite understand how they're planning this out. I think this is going to go badly this year, and I think that's going to hurt a lot of these guys for fantasy. A lot of these guys were formerly fantasy assets. I think it kills a lot of their value. Let's talk about Will Levis. I mean, he looked average last year, but we always knew he was going to look average last year. Even though a lot of people think he was going to go second overall, I think that was always just smoke. I think he was always likely to fall. We knew he wasn't the same level of prospect as a CJ Stroud, even as a Bryce Young, and certainly as an Anthony Richardson as well. There was always a lot of issues out of college. We didn't really see enough from him to suggest that he was going to be a reliable starter in the NFL. But now he's who the Titans are stuck with, and they're probably going to have to stick with him for a couple of years. If he looks really bad this year, they probably get an early pick and bring in someone new. But realistically, I think we're going to find that he's very good out wide, but he does struggle a little bit in those mid-range passes over the middle. He just doesn't seem to be good in those areas. He did try to pass the ball deep a lot last year, and it looked okay, but I don't know. I'm not really sure how this is going to work. He managed to use D-Hop effectively, but they brought in other weapons for him, which is the right thing to do. But I think they would have been better off just doing a true, actual rebuild, accepting that this is a bust year, letting Levis develop without the pressure of having these guys who are expecting to win now. They've got Mason Rudolph to back him up. I think that's a good decision. We've seen he's a good backup, and Malik Willis is definitely going to end up being a bust, even though they realistically didn't pay very much for him. Now, we talked about this running back room. It's a bit ugly. I'm not really sure exactly what to expect. Tony Bollard's been getting by last year on volume, pure volume. 250 rushes for 1,000 yards isn't what we expect from him with that really good O-line. So you would have hoped to be getting more than 4 yards per carry. He also got a whole heap of checkdowns and couldn't do a lot with them, and he wasn't used a lot around the goal line. So it was all a bit ugly for him last year. How's he going to be used this year? Well, I guess technically he's going to be used in conjunction with Spears, and therefore he's going to be getting half the carries. How that actually works out, I don't know, but I'm not particularly interested in finding out for either of these guys. Ideally, I'm probably trying to sell high on these guys if I can. Hopefully, there's someone in my league that believes that one of these two players, whichever one I have, hopefully I don't have both, hopefully they believe whichever one of these players is the guy who's going to win the job. I don't think it's going to work out that way. I think this is going to turn into a true committee situation where it's not particularly good for either of these guys. I don't think there's going to be enough points to really make either of them particularly fantasy viable. So while they're both solid options, I just don't see the upside of a lot of guys that you can get. Realistically, they're not winning you your league. You want them as your running back two or your flex guy. Spears probably has the more pure upside in the long term, but the fact that they felt the need to bring someone else in of Pollard's stature does make me a little bit nervous. If they have a really run-heavy game this season, I think that could be interesting for these guys. But with the way that they've brought in weapons around Levis, I don't think they can afford to be that run-heavy because they're not going to be able to pass the ball at all. And they're not going to be able to get the targets that these guys will feel they deserve. And that'll be a problem when you've got guys like Ridley in that dressing room. Now, let's talk about those wide receivers. Ridley is technically my number one guy in Dynasty. I do feel like he's shown that when he's healthy and not suspended, that he can be very effective. Will he be good with Will Levis? Well, he's playing on the outside. That's where Will Levis likes to go most and where he's most effective. I think he probably could be quite good. I think it's not impossible that DeAndre Hopkins starts to really show his age this year. It starts to fall away a little bit. He's been good for so long. This injury slowed him down, but he's at least looked okay last year. I do think he's going to slow this year. Ridley kind of becomes the nominal number one guy, but neither of them is going to be particularly effective. Tyler Boyd's aging. I mean, he looked okay with the Bengals, but he was always their number three. He just managed to stay healthy, and that made it look like he had good fantasy finishes. I think this year he's their main slot guy. He's doing what they hoped that Kyle Phillips would do, but it never really happened. The slot guy, I think, in this offense isn't going to be particularly effective. Even though he'll be out there a lot of the time, I think Levis is best to the exterior, so Boyd's not a guy I'm interested in at all. Traylon Burks is technically the number 4 guy, and he's someone you probably drafted quite early in fantasy a few years ago. It's disappointing, but I think he's just heading into that bust category at the moment. Even if one of these guys gets injured, I'm not particularly interested in him. Really, I'm not even particularly interested in any of these guys except perhaps Ridley if you're trying to win now and you're in a very deep league. And you have to be in a deep league because in most leagues, you're not even starting Ridley at any point during the season. Now, the tight end room's ugly. I really liked Chico Okonkwo going into last season. I thought that he could potentially play that, I guess, Delaney Walker role we saw from quite a few years ago, being that really big number one target. He looked pretty explosive in his first season. It looked like he might be able to take over, but it just didn't happen. Even without any competition there, he was only getting 77 targets on the season. That's not a lot for a top tight end, and he wasn't effective with what he did with them, getting less than 10 yards a reception. That's not very good. 1 touchdown in total is also super ugly. I don't know. The whole thing was a mess. I don't want any of these guys. They're going to be used a bit each, but realistically, I mean, if you're drafting these guys in fantasy, you're pretty darn desperate. So that's all we've got for today. Thanks for joining me for another fantasy deep dive. We are doing a fortnight of fantasy deep dive. So next, I'll be moving on to the AFC West, where we'll have a heap of top fantasy relevant players. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. Also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can find all of my rankings, my dynasty and rookie rankings on ffdfantasyfootball.com. I also write a whole heap of articles over on Razzball, so you can go to football.razzball.com and check out that stuff there. If you've got any questions, make sure you message me on Instagram or Twitter, or you can comment down in the comments as well. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in a couple of days for more fantasy deep dives on the Fantasy First Down.